Hello again. I am reading my thesis paper and offering some personal thoughts after each section. Feel free to leave comments or questions in the comment section if you've listened to this. And let's keep going. So this is part 2, Clearing the Ground, Atheism, Spiritual Atheism, and Secularism. This is where I took a moment to kind of have some definition, some ground rules, what we're talking about. So, spirituality is all the thought and movement within us. It's our sense of wonder and awe, our understanding of balance, and our measure of honesty towards our own conscience. Not believing in God doesn't exempt me from having spirit or the desire to explore it. If you place any designator in front of the word spirituality, Christian, Buddhist, Jewish, Hindu, you end up with a definition steeped in that tradition. And that's valid, yet not always necessary. Eric Steinhardt, in Believing in Dawkins, argues that theists have hijacked language like spirituality, holiness, and sacredness by tying them exclusively to God and claiming them as part of a religious magisterium. He states that we need to reclaim these concepts for spiritual naturalism. A simple example would be describing the Grand Canyon as sacred or the stars as holy. In this paper, I will use words that some might deem too spiritual for an atheist, or interpret the usage of those words as a sign of hidden faith. I propose to you that my usage of these words is poetic rather than theistic. Symbolic, poetic, and phenomenological religious language without affirming metaphysical claims. Joseph Kelly in Faith in Exile writes, "Spirituality and the spiritual life are nobody's and no group's monopolies." Religion, at its simplest, is an extrinsic expression of belief, experienced within a group or community, sometimes publicly, sometimes privately. Spirituality, on the other hand, is immanent. It unfolds within our unique selves, shaped by our inner lives and experiences. It's how we make sense of the world, our lives, and our place in the universe. According to Webster's dictionary, an atheist is simply a person who does not believe in the existence of a god or any gods. In The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins broadens this into a framework of philosophical naturalism, describing an atheist as someone who believes the physical world is all that exists, without any supernatural creative intelligence, souls, or miracles that are anything more than natural phenomena that we don't yet understand. Dawkins condenses the definition of God to only include the supernatural, citing that it has been irresponsible for celebrated scientists to use that term in their writing, since it is open to interpretation by believers to assume that the scientist is a believer, giving their faith more support than necessary. He quotes Carl Sagan in Pale Blue Dot. "How is it that hardly any major religion has looked at science and concluded, this is better than we thought? The universe is much bigger than our prophets said, grander, more subtle, more elegant. And instead they say, no, 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 my God is a little God, and I want him to stay that way." A religion, old or new, that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by the conventional faiths. Dawkins points out that the God of physicists is far removed from the Abrahamic God, and that deliberately confusing the two is, in my opinion, an act of intellectual high treason. The tendency for people today to blend the definition of God is problematic. Stephen Weinberg writes that some people have views of God that are so broad and flexible that it is inevitable that they will find God wherever they look for him. To find God in everything goes towards a pantheistic view, And I believe that if people embrace that definition, it would be clear where they stand. But to blur the definitions that society has agreed to just creates chaos. We, the world, have taken upon ourselves the right to forego definitions for the comfort of our own peace of mind. So since the concept of religion is already unfairly privileged, it seems that people are justifying any belief in any form under that umbrella term. And what we have is religious chaos. A conscientious objector can get out of going to battle on religious grounds. Yet there are still religious wars being fought around the world. So which is it? Should religion be allowed to have it both ways? I argue that definition drift protects belief but alienates non-believers, and this is why I ultimately conclude to abandon the word God. These prior arguments hold some of the objections that Dawkins and many other prominent atheists have regarding the belief or disbelief in gods. Definitions of atheism in this vein have become kind of a boogeyman for many people of faith. Why? My suspicion is that people who are horrified by the idea of atheism are really confusing it with anti-theism, which is a very different position. Webster defines an anti-theist as someone who actively opposes God or religious belief, often viewing religion itself as a source of harm. Anti-theists are atheists, yes, but not all atheists are anti-theists. In fact, most atheists are simply indifferent to religious claims. It is interesting that the new atheists, that would include the four horsemen of the non-apocalypse, Dawkins, Hitchens, Dennett, Harris, are considered the angry atheist stereotype. Lectures from these gentlemen, among others, are logical and thoughtful in my opinion. Discussions might get pointed, but there were no particularly rude comments. The exaggerated response to their discourse suggests that the listeners who took offense were straining to hold on to their beliefs. Spiritual atheism. Soren Sorensen, in his book, Spiritual Atheism, The Way of Wisdom, puts it beautifully. To illustrate my point, if someone chooses to define God as the universe itself, as many people do, then in that specific case, I believe in the existence of God, the universe, which would make me a non-literal theist according to that specific definition of God. But if someone chooses to define God as a white-bearded wizard who lives just outside of the known universe, as many people essentially do, then in that specific case, I do not believe in the literal existence of God, which would make me an atheist according to that specific definition of God. To me, this offers a gentler, more flexible way of understanding atheism, albeit not without some problems. Sorensen's definition has helped me in the past when explaining my own spirituality to others, especially to those who assume atheism must mean total anarchy rather than simple clarity about what one does or doesn't believe. This definition, however well intended, perhaps softens it a bit too much and contradicts Weinberg's thoughts that God should be held to a stricter definition. Sorensen allows for just enough space for debate. Atheism is not a religion or a belief, nor do we follow any leaders. My concept of my own atheism is not dependent on what any other atheist claims, nor is it dependent on any religious semantics. Whether one says, I don't believe in God, or God doesn't exist, does not allow the religious listener to reinterpret and rearrange the underlying thoughts. Noted atheist Sam Harris echoes this in Waking Up. He writes, yes, the cosmos is vast and appears indifferent to our mortal schemes, but every present moment of consciousness is profound. Experiencing this directly, not merely thinking about it, is the true beginning of a spiritual life. I regard this as an acknowledgement of the miraculous, used poetically, extent of the universe, and not as a capitulation to a belief in God. As for the term spiritual atheism, its origins are somewhat diffuse. A broad review of usage suggests that while the exact first appearance is difficult to pinpoint, the idea itself can be traced back to the 19th century. The specific phrase spiritual atheism, however, begins to show up more clearly in academic and popular literature in recent decades, particularly alongside the rise of non-religious forms of spirituality in the 2000s. So in contrast to Sandra Schneider's perspective on spirituality in her essay, Religion and Spirituality, Strangers, Rivals, or Partners, I reject the notion that I'm drifting into spiritual lethargy because I don't participate in organized religion. To imply that religiously disaffiliated people lack the actual accountability that is required of a member of community is not only reductive, it's insulting. Schneider claims that the quest for God is too complex and too important to be reduced to a private enterprise. But I would argue the opposite, that spirituality must be private, personal, rooted in individual experience, and accountable to one's own conscience and ethics. It's not to be capitalized on. It's immanent, not performative. Your belief is for you, and you are absolutely entitled to it. If your religion brings you faith, comfort, strength, joy, healing, all of that, then I'm happy for you. But judging others for not believing as you do, or trying to enforce your beliefs on others, this shows a lack of respect for the dignity of others and of empathy and justice for our fellow humans. To a non-believer, Schneider's assertions sound like a lack of respect for those outside her worldview and echo the long-standing tendency of some religious thinkers to use atheists or other differently minded practitioners as rhetorical scapegoats. And ironically, the critiques she levels at non-believers could just as aptly apply to many so-called religious adherents. A key concept in all of these definitions is the lack of belief in the supernatural. A God concept is not required to live a good and ethical life. With the obvious exception of psychopaths, most people understand that mindless killing is wrong, that stealing is wrong, that basic decency matters. In a quick detour to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Joshua and Bernard Gert write in the definition of morality, although a game is often a public system, its rules apply only to those playing the game. If a person does not care enough about the game to abide by the rules, she can usually quit. It is plausible that it is the definition of morality in the normative sense that it is the one public system that no rational person can quit. The fact that one cannot quit morality means that one can do nothing to escape being legitimately liable to sanction for violating its norms, except by ceasing to be a moral agent. Morality applies to people simply by virtue of their being rational persons who know what morality prohibits, requires, etc., and being able to guide their behavior accordingly. There is no study showing that atheists have a weaker moral compass than religious believers. And even if God concept were required, whose God would qualify as the God? Whose rules and beliefs should everyone follow? As established, atheism is a disbelief in God or gods. But like there are many religions, there are a few different atheistic views, and one of them is a spiritual atheist. A paradox indeed, but one that we can make sense of. André Comte-Sponville is a contemporary French philosopher, and he discusses 3 points in his book, The Little Book of Atheist Spirituality. Can we do without religion? Does God exist? Can there be an atheistic spirituality? Regarding religion, Comte-Sponville writes, faith is a belief. Fidelity, in the sense I give the word, is more like an attachment, a commitment, a gratitude. Do you need to believe in God to be convinced that sincerity is preferable to dishonesty, courage to cowardice, generosity to egoism, gentleness and compassion to violence and cruelty, justice to injustice, love to hate? The dogmatic structure of any religion that aims to homogenize the behavior of its followers risks reducing ethical development to obedience. It does not enhance the emotional and ethical capabilities of its people. It only provides rules, either rewarded or punished through the establishment. If the message from an organization is beautiful, Comte Sponville asks, why should my atheism prevent me from seeing the greatness of this message? It does not hinder my appreciation in the least. Much like Stoic philosophers, Comte Sponville notes that our highest good is living and behaving humanly. Religion can neither guarantee that we do so, nor exempt us from needing to do so. Comte Sponville gives us his definition of God. By God, I mean an eternal, spiritual, and transcendent being, both exterior and superior to nature, who consciously and voluntarily created the universe. He is assumed to be perfect and blessed, omniscient and omnipotent, infinitely kind and just. The Creator, being his own cause, is himself uncreated. He is the supreme being upon whom everything depends and on who himself depends on nothing. He is the enactment and the personification of the absolute. Unlike Soren Sorensen's sprawling, inclusive definition, this is a narrow, albeit elegant, definition that parallels Dawkins. On an initial read, Comte Sponville's definition is beautiful and very much what people assume God to mean. However, this definition also limits God to being this definition. And this is where the argument lies. What is God? What is your definition? By defining the expansiveness that God is sometimes attributed to, we also confirm those boundaries. And then atheists can more accurately say that they don't believe. I conclude that continually expanding the definition of God in response to critique renders the concept unfalsifiable. If one were to keep moving the goalposts in any capacity, they would eventually win. One can argue that the conversation would continue, but it would be tedious at best and lacking on some basic ground rules. Why doesn't Comte Sponville believe? Says the proofs are weak. To say ontologically that God exists because we say he does? To say cosmologically that God exists because the universe? To use argument by design as proof that a creativity and ordering intelligence must be God? Comte Sponville rightly claims that these as philosophically problematic. Comte Sponville combines spirituality with experience and notes that the value of Romain Rolland's The Oceanic Feeling. Rolland describes it as a sense of indissoluble union with the great all and of belonging to the universal, very much as a wave or a drop of water belongs to the ocean. This experience has been described throughout the history of the world by people of all ages, life experiences, and beliefs. The oceanic feeling belongs to no religion or philosophy, and this is a good thing. It is neither dogma nor an act of faith. It is a recurring theme that ethics, morals, fidelity, and communion are all standards that apply to humanity regardless of spiritual status. And this reinforces Kelly's statement that spirituality belongs to everyone. Secularism is another concept that often gets vilified in public discussions and casually lumped together with atheism. Ronald Lindsay, in The Necessity of Secularism, writes, "What's interesting and ironic about the hysteria over secularism is that secularism, properly understood, is the best protection religious believers have, particularly in a society they no longer control. Secularism protects freedom of conscience, including freedom of religion. It doesn't threaten it. So secularism and atheism are not the same. The former is a moral and ethical framework for organizing society. The latter is simply a disbelief in God. Can atheists be secularists? Certainly. Most atheists, many of them, are secular humanists. But the two terms are not mutually dependent. Lindsay argues that in a religiously pluralistic society, secularism is the strongest safeguard for religious freedom. It ensures not only freedom of religion, but freedom for religion and freedom from religion. Secular humanism, broadly speaking, is a non-religious life philosophy that relies on reason, science, and human-centered ethics to guide decision-making. One of Lindsay's central points is that public discourse requires a shared language. When someone argues from within their religious tradition, that argument only makes sense to people who share it. To everyone else, it creates unnecessary divide, one that secularism seeks to avoid by giving us a neutral common ground for conversation. Ethical norms should be grounded in human flourishing, rational inquiry, and mutual accountability rather than revelation or sacred degree. Human dignity and responsibility are intrinsic to our condition, and it is through conscious participation in the world, not obedience to transcendence, that we create just and meaningful societies. So in this section, I hope to just explain using other people's thoughts what atheism is. Simply put, you don't believe in God, or God doesn't exist, whatever. But spiritual atheism, it's kind of bordering more on this sense of wonder and awe, this sense of internal morals and ethics, of knowing who we are, and really shunning the idea of this external authority, of saying that something else is holding responsibility when we hold the responsibility. Okay, if you're relying on somebody else to reward you, that's external authority. That means you're leaving it in somebody else's hands, and I'm just not about that. I really enjoyed the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, their definition of morality, because that's really what it is. Morality is a socially agreed upon way of behaving and acting. And yeah, there are some people who just, they want to opt out to that, and it's really crazy. Secularism is another thing. I've seen a lot of people be like, oh, secularism is evil. And it's not. It's literally just saying, look, if you want to do something for society, if you want to have rules and laws, it has to be something that everybody can understand why. You start bringing in your religious ideas, that's not going to apply to somebody who doesn't share that religion. So secularism is just saying, no religion. Let's just deal with this as it is. Okay? So anyway, if you have questions, feel free to write them. I would love them because I never know what people have questions on. And yeah, thanks. Thanks for watching.